Not like, I'm from Toledo, I lived on the lake. I know what humid is.
Okay.
Yeah, being wrapped in plastic, I know what that's like.
Okay. Well, my friend Karl, he's a lay person, a lay member like pretty much everybody here, but he has a special nickname out in Arizona. He is lovingly referred to as the conference theologian. He mentioned last night that he has 4,000 books in his library so far, and he's hoping that it'll get bigger.
Not my wife, though.
Oh, your wife doesn't? Okay. He was trying to encourage me last night to stick a few bookcases up in the middle of the living room with nothing to lean against, but I'm not there yet. But anyway, so Karl is going to speak to us right now, and then again for church, and then there will be 2 more presentations this afternoon. There is some question about the afternoon because some people wanted to at least go over to First Church to pay their respects to Richard Linton. Did I say the name right? Okay. So some people were wanting to go over there and pay their respects. So we will discuss the scheduling for this afternoon so we can at least try to accommodate that. So, Karl, the time is yours.
Well, Shabbat Shalom. So some of us that weren't here last night, we missed a good time, huh? I wanted to do an introduction. I think we have them up here. Here they are. The series that we're doing here is new. I am a little hot, I think. And while new, I haven't done it before, so please excuse me if it's a little rough here in places. I have spoken on all the topics and done research into them. And it really kind of progressed from this little chart right here. And I made copies. Those interested afterwards, you can come up and get a copy. You're welcome to it. And what this chart shows is the organizations that came out of the Millerite movement. And, of course, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is part of that. And off of the Seventh-day Adventist line, you'll see various offshoots and growths out of the Adventist Church over a period of time. And we're not certainly covering all the movements, but we're covering some of the major ones and some of the dissonant movements within the church, or dissonant ideas. And what I hope to present isn't just a series of facts and figures about here are the people, here's what happened, here's what they did, here's what they believed, and create an us-them mentality. But I want to demonstrate or illustrate, I think, the struggle that God's church has been through and is going through to preach the 3 angels' messages. He called us up in place and time to give this great message. And it's why we're Seventh-day Adventists. It's not because of the other things, because of the other doctrines. As good as they are. If we wanted to be Sabbath keepers, there are other places we could go and be Sabbath keepers. We're Seventh-day Adventists for more reasons than that, and that is to give the 3 angels' messages, the last message to the world before Jesus comes. And there's other movements that Satan wants to throw in to try to distract us from that calling. Anything he can do to take our mind off of that. And so in some ways, we can look at this chart as an organization of distractions of what he's done. So it's not to set us up as an us-them, but to help us to focus on what God truly called us to be and to do. So if you're interested in the chart, you're more than welcome to come up and take a copy, or maybe even pick up another copy for a friend or something. That's fine. And I don't think they're going to last here. I'm going to set them here before they all end up on the floor. And we're going to talk today. Last night we talked about the first major movement, breakaway from what would become the Seventh-day Adventist Church, was the Church of God Adventist, today known as the Church of God Seventh Day. The primary group was organized in Denver, Colorado. And today we're going to talk about a different group, the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. Now, anybody familiar with the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement? This is all new territory here? I know Ethan is. The Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement is interesting. I know some personally. In fact, I visited their church. They're in Phoenix. They have a small church. And it's interesting the kind of turnover they have. When I visited the one time, it was largely Hispanic. And they had to have translation. Some years later, it was largely North American. Hardly any Spanish at all. So it seems to shift in time. Same church, same location, like a whole new congregation just moved in. Everybody else went somewhere else. It was pretty interesting. But we're going to talk a little bit about how they got started. And they got started primarily out of World War I during the war. And they all started with the idea of wanting to be good Adventists. You want to be a good Adventist, right? They did too. They were really sincere about what they wanted to do. But they ended up forgetting to be followers of Jesus Christ. And I note that because we know through our evangelistic meetings that we can convince people about our Adventist truth. And they can become Seventh-day Adventists. And at the same time not know Jesus Christ. You may have met a few. Good Adventists on the books, pay their tithes, very active, and they don't know Jesus. And you know, none of the doctrines make sense without Christ. The Sabbath has no meaning, right? Unless you know the person of the Sabbath. And that seems to be where they kind of lost some of their direction. And it began with this man here. You ever heard of L.R. Conradi? There you go. There would be the old-timer here. In fact, when you were baptized, what, 1931? He was still in the church. It was before he left the church. So Conradi was a German, and he was a vice president of the General Conference. He was the president of the European division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church around the time of the First World War. And he was known for creating quite a separation or a schism within the church. He would end up leaving the church and would, in his last days, plant Seventh-day Baptist churches around Europe. So we'll talk a little bit about Lewis here. There we go. The Seventh-day Adventist leaders in Europe, when the war began, had determined on their own, without any counsel from the GC, that it was permissible for the Adventists to bear arms and to serve in the military and other changes which went against traditional Adventist beliefs. They basically told the Kaiser that our Seventh-day Adventist members, our young men, will participate in the war and carry guns, and will do it on the Sabbath. So how do you feel about that? Yeah. So you can imagine what was going on at that time within there. The East German Union leader has sent out a letter dated August 4, 1914, to the Kaiser. He says, "We have bound ourselves together in the defense of the fatherland, and under these circumstances, we will also bear arms on Saturday." By the way, that was a picture of the Kaiser to the right, if you didn't catch that. Similar declarations made by Conradi, the president of the European Division, along with his other associate, Drenhaus, president of the Saxon Conference, on March 5th, 1915. He had joined in. So he didn't originate this, but he certainly supported it. And so with this kind of reaction, we had about 2,000 conscientious objectors within the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Germany and around Austria and whatnot, Hungary, who stood up and said, "Not me." They made their stand that they were not going to fight in the war. And for doing that, they suffered reprisals. They had understood, and this is sometime a little later, it wasn't right at that moment, that Ellen White had talked about a Reformation. And she says, "A revival of true godliness among us is the greatest and most urgent of all needs. To seek this should be our first work." So they're reading about a revival. And they actually read about revival texts in volume 9 of the Testimonies. And so they figured that what was happening, or had happened to them, because they're looking back on this when they're seeing this, is that there had been a test for a revival within the church. And they met the test. They hence were the Reformed group. And the rest of the church went off track. And they became the true carriers of the Adventist message. The Seventh-day Adventist Reform Church is the name then that they would later take. So this is the origination of that concept. This is interesting because Ellen White, from the very earliest days, from before we were even organized, we used a quote last night, dated from 1853, where she talked about revival among our people. And this was an ongoing discussion. But many groups that would become dissidents or offshoots of the Adventist church would again rely on this concept of revival and think that it would meant a calling out, a separate group, a separate organization that would have to disassociate with the church. And so it was all taken upon themselves, that they were the ones who were reformed. And the emphasis I made last night is the emphasis I want to make again here, because this is another example, is the emphasis about what Reformation is. Reformation begins where? Begins with you, begins with me. It's not me looking for you to reform. Because when I do that, what happens? I set your reformation up based on my standards. And you know my standards aren't high enough. And however pious you might think you are, either are yours. We must start with ourselves. And as we each start with ourselves, the revival will catch and go across. But what happens is these groups begin to look to themselves as the ones who have revived and the others who have not. And it becomes an us-them dissidence. We've set it up within our own church. We've talked about it, haven't we? About what they did and an us-them mentality. And we know that's not healthy. That leads us into conflict. It doesn't lead to unity. And we don't have to agree with somebody wholly to have unity, to be able to walk together in our message. None of us are ever going to agree 100% on things because we're human beings. Someone asked me, why so many churches? Why so many denominations? The Bible speaks about one faith, right? One baptism, one church. There was one body of Christ. Why so many different groups? Because they got people in them. People are in these groups. People like you and me. That's why we have different denominations. But Christ will come and find us. He will make the solution to that. He'll bring us together. That's where our unity's at. This is in the Church of God, not Church of God. I got to remember what I'm speaking on. This is in the SDA Reformed Churches magazine, their main church organ. And it just shows you that the mentality of what originated with this group in around circa 1940 to 26 when they organized officially is still with them today. We're still dealing with the same kind of issues that they're dealing with. This author writes in that little article in there called The Purifying of God's Remnant Church, and this was actually part one of two. Two distinct classes were prophesied to come into existence from within the Advent movement. Now, have anybody ever read anything from Ellen White that had prophesied of two distinct movements that were going to come into existence? Nothing. Even if you're not well read on Ellen White, I think something that astounding we would know about, right? You would have heard about that for sure. But this just shows that what we've taken is certain quotes and positions of Ellen White, and we make them into something we want them to be, more than what they were. And we know that she did not call for a calling out movement. But yet, this is the position that they see that Ellen White was calling for a separate group. One class, which includes the majority of the Seventh-day Adventists, would eventually join the ranks of the opposition, the world. Hence, we would join Babylon. And meanwhile, the small class would cling to Jesus' truth and be led out from the world. The trials on the commandments of God versus the commandments of men came first to the Advent movement by the Civil War in the United States. The church was victorious during that particular trial. I just want to stop there. If you're not familiar with how the church began to address non-combatancy in the war. A good place to read the history of that is in Arthur White's biography on his grandmother, Ellen White. And you'll be able to read the story there about her struggle with how to deal with non-combatancy. This all occurred at the time we began to organize as a people. We didn't take the name Seventh-day Adventists until October 1st, 1860. And this is right on the heels of the beginning of the Civil War. We didn't officially organize as a denomination until May of 63. And so here we are just within 2 years of the end of the war when we officially become a denomination. So it was all happening at the time we were developing the organization. The issues of where we stood on non-combatancy. And it was a struggle then, and it was a struggle later on in World War I, and in many ways it's still a struggle with us as a people. There's no cut and clear dry answers to that. But they had understood in their minds that we had come to a hard and fast decision regarding Civil War. The problem with the SDA Reformed Church is that they have a stilted view of Adventist history. They're really pretty ignorant on it. And even in the thick book on the Adventist Reform Movement, I have found many mistakes regarding Adventist history. And just so that you know, I'm quite a bit of a historian myself, so I know from where it comes from. I've read a lot on Adventist history. It's been part of my study as I worked my way back in. I told some of my testimony last night about the things and how I got started on my journey back. And so it's from these particular mindsets that they developed their theology into a hardcore position. The majority of the Seventh-day Adventists, he says, went the way of the world in 1914. And you can see when you talk like that, it sets up in the mindset the us-them conflict. And then that creates your division. It also helps to justify you in what position you're in. And the statement from Ellen White, published in Testimony to Ministers, and I find this interesting, is because the movement essentially begins to find their place of separation in 1914, the year before Ellen White's passing. And though they didn't organize until 1926, they're largely based on the pre-war position of Adventism. And so the books that would come later on, the compilations, they look at very skeptically. They're very skeptical about them. But yet here, Testimony of Ministers is a book they use a lot. And this is a compilation. And granted, this compilation has larger, in context, tracts or sections, not just paragraphs here and there. But they use this quite a lot. And in Testimony to Ministers, page 515, there's a statement taken that she prepared in 1913. She says that I have been deeply impressed by the scenes that I have recently passed before me in the night season. There seemed to be a great movement, she says, a work of revival, going forward in many places. Our people were moving into line, responding to God's call. And so she's talking about this future Reformation. And she sees God's people coming into line and producing, finally, the work that was going to take place. And so, again, groups like the Reform Movement will latch hold to this to justify their movement in and separate from God's movement here within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, as if God's not capable of guiding his church, that he needs something separate and outside in order to accomplish the effect. Here the issues become known about what was going on in Germany. Are you familiar with the name W.A. Spicer? Spicer was not a very aggressive man. He was really more of a clerk, a bookkeeper, an office person. He was not the front man, the promoter. A.G. Daniels, whatever you might think of him historically, was much more of the outgoing, gregarious leader, very strong leader. He was the man who was in the front, who took risks, and eventually got shot down for it. In fact, if you read some modern books written less than 10 years ago, the reason why A.G. Daniels was not voted in the president's office in 1922, the reason why he failed to get back in, was because he ate chicken. You can't make this up. But these are some of the issues that he was facing. And here, after he wasn't voted back in, he had thought, and he worked with the committee who put the name forward, that what the church needed was a time of peace. Kind of like, let's back away, slow down what we're doing here, and get our wits about ourselves. And he thought the person that could bring peace and uniformity, not among what was happening in the higher levels, was W.A. Spicer. Spicer could bring calm. He wasn't a controversial figure, and so he was elected as president after A.G. Daniels. But this is well before he was elected, right after the 1914 when they had left, right around just before the end of the war. Spicer takes a trip over during the war still, but he goes over at great risk. The Germans have the U-boats, been shooting things out of the water, so he really risked his life to get over there. And he found out what was going on. He learned the wrong that had been done to the minority. And I admit that the church, how they acted was wrong. It was brash, and I'm going to show you some a little later where the mindset kind of comes from. But they stood for what they believed. And we have to give them credit for that. And he knew the strife among the German members. They developed bitterness between both groups that had taken place over some time. He was well aware of that. He was well aware of Conrady's role in the event. The extreme views of these groups were driving each other in different directions, different areas. We see that happening today within the church when two groups have battles with each other. Pick a subject, women's ordination. We know what's going on. We experience it still today. And this is what was happening. So the conference became aware of what was going on. And so they wanted to make some additions. This is the book that I was talking about that was on the history of the Reform movement. And naturally, they want to write from their position, so sometimes they might say things a certain way. And you got to cut them some slack, because we probably do the same thing, While Conrady was a leader of the SDA church over in Europe, he was whitewashed, they say, and defended even by the General Conference representatives. And after he left the Adventist church, some leaders began to admit that they should have admitted at the beginning of the trouble. You ever have that happen? That maybe we should have done something in the past that we didn't do. There was a time you should have stood up and said something, but you kept your mouth shut. But now that we see 2020, hindsight's 2020, right? We know later on, boy, I should have done something because I didn't see this other thing coming. And so the leaders were beginning to be aware that there was a problem. And now how to deal with it. What do we do? Because now you got to deal with it. And so what happens is this whole core philosophy is based off the mindset of Conrady, the influence that he had, which I come to find out was the mindset of the German people. This is a European mindset. This isn't something that just happened and isn't just to be blamed on one man. But in 1886, in the Review and Herald, was published a letter that he wrote. He wrote it to Elder George Butler, president of the General Conference. And in there, he talks about the Baptist church and how they had to sign up for the military duty, how they had to come to terms with non-combatancy. And so he says, the Baptists, had to admit the bearing of arms, and we, Seventh-day Adventists, shall have to do the same if we are ever tolerated here. Since considering the subject, I see why the governments of Europe are so strict. If any denomination should be released from the requirement, all the young men would join it to escape the army. And this is nearly 30 years before the breakout of World War I. So already, Conrady was in the mindset the Seventh-day Adventists were going to have to bear arms and do it on Sabbath. He was already committed to an idea of combatancy, of joining with the nation during the time of war. Tantamount with this set up was that on both sides you could have Adventists shooting Adventists. Adventist Americans on one side with guns shooting, and on the other side the Germans. What kind of picture is that? So you can see the dilemma that the church was brought into. So there was good reason. Our brothers of the SDA Reformed Church originally did not get a fair shake. They were treated badly in that sense. However, the brethren had no desire to form a separate organization. Technically, they did not, but they had well, we're familiar with the historic church movement, the letters of Hope International, Heartland Institute, the old days with John Osborne and Prophecy Countdown, Steps to Life Ministry, Vance Farrell's, all these independents. And we know that they have letters and they communicate with each other and this stuff goes out. And this is the same thing was happening here. This was an independent group and all their letters and little newsletters and communications were all going out. And people were getting all this information. And they really didn't want to separate, but during this time, they're beginning to call the Adventist Church Babylon. So now we have some disconnect setting up here. While they weren't looking for a separate organization, says at least not on a permanent or final basis, it was believed that the General Conference leadership of the SDA Church would vindicate the position of the faithful minority and set things in order. That was from the book, History of Reform, History of the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. And frankly, I wish the church would have said more about it. Even A.G. Daniels, when he goes over there, we'll talk about that here. This view was held with a certain triumphalism in that they met the test and reformed. And I say this because I know some SDA reform. In the persecution and in the position they take, they have a position of being triumphant. And they lord it over you because we're the good Adventists. You're not. That's the mindset. SDA Reform will go visit Seventh-day Adventist churches in order to look at what's wrong with you. What you're eating, how you dress, how you act in a sanctuary, anything they can lay hold of and accuse the Adventist church of apostatizing. Anything they'll lay hold of. They don't come for worship, they come to find evidence to accuse you. And that's like some other organizations. Why are they here? Secondly, they come into churches because then they come in and try to find people that they might convince to come join the SDA Reform Church. I don't know if you had any of that experience here with the SDA Reform, but it's the same thing. And I figured, well, why come in and hijack someone else's platform? If you have a message you want to give, go and evangelize, just like the Adventist Church does. We have our evangelistic meetings, we advertise, people come, we speak. You know, they join or don't join. You can go do the same. But they want to come here. Because already you're Adventist, so you have a certain thing that you agree with, and now they just want to find out where they can take you. Oh, you want to be a better Adventist? Then follow this way. And the ones today, I was talking, one friend, the basis of fellowship is based off not just a health reform message, but veganism. In order to be an SDA Reform member now, you have to be not just a vegetarian, but you have to be vegan. And that's a test of fellowship. And this is some of the extremes they go to. In fact, the elders will come to your home and check your cupboards and look for that devil pepper that you have up there. You know, I would go to camp meeting. I shouldn't say this where I'm being recorded. I get in trouble for it, but I'll say it anyways. What are they going to do, fire me? So I'd go to camp meeting when I worked at the bookstore. I'd get there before camp meeting started. Camp prep, pitch. They call it camp pitch. And I noticed that in the cafeteria, on the table, each table was a salt shaker and a pepper shaker with black pepper. Okay? Friday, camp meeting starts. Friday night. So Friday lunch, salt and pepper's there. Friday night, pepper's gone. No pepper. And I get there and said, what happened to the Adventist pepper? Because that's the only way we can have it called kosher, is to call it Adventist pepper. Then it's kosher. Then I'm looking, how pretentious is that, huh? If you're going to have pepper, have pepper. I'm not your judge. But don't be taking it off the table to try to make me think something different. Listen, if I go to somebody, they want to eat a nice piece of pork chop or ham, eat it. I'm not your judge. And let me tell you, if it's the end and we're starving and there's a ham sandwich there or I starve, guess what's going to happen to that ham sandwich? You ain't got a chance. Listen, okay, I don't eat pork. It's for health reasons, Ellen White says, not for religious reasons. I don't eat pork. And I figure God don't want me to eat it, and our bread and water, sure. Ellen White says that in great controversy. But I just use that as an illustration, is that it's not about the food. Sometimes we make things more than what they are. And then we drive each other nuts, focusing on this little stuff instead of focusing on what? Jesus and the three angels' messages that he called us to give. Satan is happy to take us away from what God called us to do, whether it's outside the church or inside the church. We're fighting over, I know a pastor once who got hired for a church, and then somebody saw him in town, and he lost a job. He didn't even know they saw him. But word got back to the conference, and he lost a job. You know why he lost it? He had brown shoes. Brown shoes. Anybody know what I'm talking about? You never heard of that? This is how we drive ourselves nuts sometimes. And then you wonder why this happens. Okay? This is why, because Ellen White had talked about, in her day, time, place, circumstance, that a pastor should have a couple of nice black suits in his closet. Black suits. Can't have a brown suit. Got to be black. And of course, you got to have black shoes with the black suit, not brown shoes. And the fact that he had brown shoes, he wasn't kosher to be a pastor for that church. And he lost a job. You can see some of the problems. And I hear stuff like this, and I says, ain't no wonder we have problems. We create some of this stuff ourselves. And we're focusing on that instead of the three angels' messages. If we share the gospel with your neighbor, can I share with you what Christ has done for me? That's good news, ain't it? Enlarge the kingdom. Jesus is coming. It's not just to give the everlasting gospel to those who dwell on the earth and to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. It's not just, it's all of that, but it's not just that. It's the coming king. The kingdom is coming with the king. It's the consummation of the gospel. We got great news to give. We got a great message. And Satan is happy to sidetrack us. He is just happy to take us off sidetracks. Because then we're not focused on sharing. And then when we do try to share the gospel message with people, we might have some folks say, but you guys do this strange thing and you do this, and then the next thing you know, we got problems. We cloud the message. We do things that keep people from hearing the message, and we got to be about a way to bridge across to the people, not isolate ourselves. We can't come to a position where we say, well, we're going to believe our truth and you believe yours and go your way, and we're going to be right here. God didn't call us to be that. He called us to give a message. And I can't give a message to you unless I can build a bridge. I got to find a way to get to you. And if I got stuff in the way, you're never going to hear it because you can't get to it. It's not just the fact of me coming to you with a message. We have to win an opportunity to share the gospel. And people got to learn to trust us. You won't hear somebody, you won't trust somebody you don't know until you become friends with them. Then you can share the gospel. But we get stuck. And this is a prime example of getting stuck. A common characteristic found among all classes of reformers is the disposition to criticize everyone, especially the Adventist church. And anytime you hear a group that's critical, red flags should go up. You know there's a problem. And you should ask questions. Even within your own group. If it's you who are being critical, you need to stop, take pause, and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? Satan, get away from me. Because he's creating a disconnect between you and that person. How are you ever going to get reconnected to someone if you're only criticizing them? Stop. Find something good to think about that person and get connected. You don't have to agree with them on everything. It's okay. It really is. It's all right. And so this is what they had, this mindset. One, doctrines were rejected because it would make them look too much like SDA Church. There were doctrines that they would not accept. It made them look too much like the mother church they broke off from. Secondly, the author in the book received a review for many years just to try to find ways to prove the SDA Church had fallen into apostasy. People get the magazine just for that reason, just to look for it. So, Kramer, another reformer, writes in his history, because members of the this Kramer here had been an Adventist. In fact, he was a head of the North American division for the SDA Reformed Church and left the Reformed Church, came back into the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Actually came into the Seventh-day Adventist. He had never been in it. He was always a reformer. And became a pastor in the North American division. And he writes in his book, because the members of the Reform movement had no encouragement to read any material other than what was provided to them, their thinking was, to a great degree, became inbred. And we do a lot of inbred things within small groups. We hear someone say something, we parrot it back, and we become this little group of our sayings, our belief, our habits, and what we do, and it's all inbred within this group. And then we find out later, where did all that come from? We really had no basis. But it's how it's inbred into a larger group like this. It says, these people are to be deeply pitied because of their ignorance, brought about by preconceived opinions. And what's sorry about it is these are good people who want to be pious, who want to follow Jesus, who want to do the right thing. But they get caught up into this cycle. And this is what happens. The meeting in 1920 began to open up discussion with the General Conference to try to find a way to bring this group back in with them. So in 1920, they go to Friedenthal, and they attempt to reconcile with the GC at the SDA Missionary College there on July 21st through the 23rd, 1920. A.G. Daniel shows up, W.W. Prescott and some others. They go there and try to help these people, talk with a representative group of the SDA Reformed Church. So the group called the Reformers had high hopes that the GC would admit the betrayal of the European leaders and that they had been loyal to the message, the Reformers, that is. So the opportunity of the meeting with the General Conference President and other executive committee members was welcomed by our pioneers, the Reformers. This is coming from the Reformers' view, who thought they could get a fair and impartial hearing. And they soon realized, however, that they were mistaken in their optimistic expectations. So hopes were dashed because things weren't going to work out the way they had hoped. The same mindset happens. This is the current president of the Reform Movement that's here in America out of Roanoke, Virginia, because there's two major groups of the SDA Reformed Church. And he calls them the two percenters. And the two percenters were about 2% of the German group, are the ones who rose up and said no. So they're called the two percenters. And so when he refers to that, it's just referring to the Reformers. One, he says, what position does the General Conference take concerning the decision made by the German leaders in 14? He's talking about the Reformed General Conference. With regard to the fourth and sixth commandment. Oh, I'm sorry. No, this is the GC, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. These were the positions that he brings forth still today that were noted back at the meetings in 1920. What was the SDA General Conference position regarding the fourth and sixth commandments? What position does the General Conference of the American Brethren take towards the testimonies of Sister White today? Are they inspired by God or not? And should we continue to proclaim health message? They had a problem connecting health reform with this. And that's why they brought this point up, because they thought there was a neglect of health reform by the General Conference here. So should we continue to proclaim health reform, which she which she brought to us as the right arm of the message or not? And their understanding of the right arm of the message had an association in their mind that the gospel message, that the health reform message was somehow the gospel message. And we know that when she used this term, that the health message was the right arm, she was referring to it as the message, as the vehicle that would bring us into contact with people that would not ordinarily come into contact with where we could share the message, coming into people in our sanitariums, in our hospitals, in our clinics, who would not necessarily come to a Revelation seminar, say. So the health message was a way for us to actually begin to reach people, minister to their needs, again, build this bridge, and be able to witness and give the message of the three angels. And we find stories like this all the time. Anybody who's done missionary work, medical missionary work, knows how that works, right? You know exactly how that works because you've seen that work. That's the right arm of the message. That's what it means. And is our message, according to Revelation 14, 6-12, national or international? That's a moot question. I don't know. Still not quite sure how they came up with asking that question, or maybe thought that that was a problem. That the three angels' messages is what? International, right? It's worldwide. We're to give the message word. Every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. It's in 4 parts, the 4 compass points, to go around the world, everywhere. The GC leaders speak out about the Reform movement. In the letter, A.G. Daniels, there's a little book called Protocol, which was published by the church in Germany, the Adventist church, of the minutes of the meetings. And the SDA Reform accept this. They don't criticize it. They actually use it. And I got my copy from the SDA Reform church. So it's okay. And in there, Daniel says, now we must say that each individual has had the right to form his own convictions and to make it a matter of conscience in regard to the war. Now, this was completely separate from what the Reform group was believing. They thought it had to be a test of faith. To be an Adventist, you have to say no. You have to be a conscientious objector. If not, we're going to disfellowship you. Whereas Daniels is now speaking as the president of the church and says, we give you, the member, the choice to be a conscientious objector or not. It's something you have to come to terms with and make your stand before God and country of whether or not you will stand. The church has always promoted the position of conscientious objection, but it was not to be made a point of membership. Not to be made a point to where you would be disfellowshipped because you thought you had a duty to do and you went and did it. So this was Daniel's expressing his view, which is completely contrary to the Reform movement. He says, and if your conscience does not allow you to put on a uniform, then it is your privilege to lay it off. And you can stop at any place where your conscience tells you. He says that because in the Adventist church, when we encourage people not to carry the arms, what do we usually encourage them to do? Still join the service and become a medic or some non-combatant position, right? Whereas in the Reform mind, they couldn't even do that because that would still be aiding and abetting the cause of war, even though you weren't personally carrying a gun or doing anything. So Daniels is telling them, wherever your conscience allows you to stop. Where did I leave off? Oh. But this must be a matter of conscience. When, however, you take your own conscience as a standard and want to compel others to act according to your conscience, then you overstep your rights. And that's what was happening. A small group was saying, you have to come up to our level, what we say, or else. And they put themselves in as the standard. And they have promoted even today that that was the standard position of the Adventist church during the Civil War, is their position today. Again, a stilted view of Adventist history. They don't have a really good understanding of it. And again, in Protocol, he says, what I would like to show is the difference between someone who simply lives according to his conscience and someone who takes a belligerent position towards his brethren. We regret at these two things. This is what the conference is saying, the GC. They regret. One, first, the open opposition which arose against the brethren who had the leadership in their hands, and then, otherwise he was sorry. Daniel was saying, look, we're sorry for the leaders, Conradi and the other leaders, presidents of the conferences. And the publication and distribution of documents which we aimed at causing division among the brethren. We're sorry for what our leaders did here, and we're sorry to see what you reformers have done in all the literature and tracts that you produced that created dissension and division. of stirring this pot up. So there was fought enough during the movement to go around for both sides. They were creating the issues, making them worse, not better. Because they, after all, were right. They were on the side of right, so they really played that up. Rejection at the 22 GC session, the reformers were disfellowshipped, not for being objectors to the war duty. That's not why they were disfellowshipped. It was for the opposition the movement stirred up in the churches. It's instantly, as they said, no, we won't fight, they created these almost riots, you would say, picketing. A lot of dissension came back towards the church. And this kind of disturbance and division, when they were asked to temper, created a position where they had to be disfellowshipped. So it wasn't like they rose up and said, no, we won't fight and carry guns, and the church stepped back, well, then we're going to kick you out. That's not how that worked. There was an opposition going on. And because of their dissension, how they presented it caused them to be disfellowshipped. From the beginning, it was held that each person was free to act according to his conscience, and it remained in the churches, to remain in the churches. Only they should openly confess their position to the government. Otherwise, you have your choice, I have mine. And you need to make it known so the government knows where you stand. Don't be a coward and hide behind something else and pretend. Say what your position is. And they had to be open to the government regarding that. And you see how the government, this is an illustration showing how the government viewed conscientious objectors. Basically, cowards and effeminate. They're on the war line. They're cleaning up dustpan. They're doing a little house cleaning while everybody else is shooting and dying. So, 2 reformers' representatives were sent to the San Francisco General Conference session to appeal to President Daniels to present their case before the assembly, the GC in session. Daniel says, we cannot allow these questions to come before the whole delegation. Now, that wasn't just an arbitrary statement, because he thought there was a problem, is that they weren't fully reconciled with the church. They were still calling the Adventist church Babylon, yet they wanted to reconnect with the church. It made no sense. And so he wasn't bringing this to the floor of the delegates to bring up for open discussion about whether or not these people should be able to come back in. And besides, total membership, we know, lies where? With the churches. Whether a person is a member or not is right here, not at the GC level. GC can't kick anybody out of the church. It starts with us. So he would not bring it to the floor. And so he says, our brethren then had no other alternative than to organize separately in a definite way to carry on the gospel work, lifting up the standard, pouring forth the straight truth. So they had to organize by 1926, and they really had to organize because they had no other choice. Not that they really technically wanted to, but they had to organize. And they begin to publish their little books here. The Christian beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, these fundamentals are flawed. There's typographical errors in there, and there's some things that need to be changed. However, they look at their brethren, their founders, as almost being God-inspired prophets. This was a God-ordained movement as they presented the reform. And so they refused to make any changes to this thing, to this document, including the typographical errors, because to do so would be that their brothers were in error, were not perfect, and would have to cause them to capitulate in other areas. This is how hard they made their stand. And then their little book called The Good Way, and they have their basic chapters on their basic positions of who and what they are and their basic beliefs. And you find them to be not just conservative, but in many ways very fundamentalists in their actions and how they act. These are 2 key areas, two key books that you can look at regarding them. Their idea was based on the text in Jeremiah 6:16. Calls for go back to the old past. The problem is that they often didn't know what the old paths are. As they tried to hold to the old paths over the years, they also picked up errors and held tenaciously to them regardless to any evidences to the contrary, including some early Adventist positions that had to be changed. Arianism, Christ as a created being. Many of them still hold to that. Nature of Christ issues. And the Reformers' model, back to the old path, prevents corrections of the principles of faith. The little document I showed you there. Leaders there wouldn't make any corrections to it, as I said before. And the booklet continues as it was first adopted, without even editorial changes. Originally organized in 1919 in Germany as the International, well, I'm not going to read the German, the International Missionary Society of Seventh-day Adventist Old Movement Standing Firm since 1844. That was the name of the group. Nothing in there about reform. And I don't know if they want to be Old Movement Standing Firm since 1844. Because if you're a Seventh-day Adventist 1844 type, I'm going to ask you, you having ham or pork tonight for dinner? Because 1844, we were still Sunday keepers. Tobacco was okay. How far back do you want to go? As far as the Advent, they were. So again, this demonstrates their ignorance of Adventist history. But the first name adopted made claim that they held to the teachings of the Advent movement in 1844. Their ignorance of history, however, was profound. And like I said before, there were still Sunday observance, pork eating, tobacco using, even the shut door. When they perceived that a reform movement within the church had been prophesied, this had come later, then they began to change their name. And that's when they adopted the reform movement name. So now the church in Germany, over in Europe, is the International Missionary Society, Seventh-day Adventist Church Reform Movement. In America, it's just simply the Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement. During the war, the Reform Movement did not meet until 1948. The last conference was in 1938. Plans to move the headquarters to the U.S. On May 22, 1951, there was a debate. Delegates were ejected, and the delegation initially representing about 40% of the membership was now separated into two groups. And they were declared disfellowshipped from the church. There were issues over church organization and certain things like that. So on May 22, the delegation, that was the agreement. So the door was closed against this group. They resulted in two separate organizations in May of 1951. You had the European church were trying to reorganize the American movement and take ownership of it. So as the two groups organized, then the European group tried to bring up leaders into the American group to kind of take over leadership positions, which would usurp control of the property, and actually kind of put it back together that way. But we ended up then with two groups, primarily the International Missionary Society, West Germany, and what referred to by many people as simply the 51 movement, which is headquarters in Roanoke, Virginia, which is the one where I get most of my material from because I don't have to pay international shipping rates. Each using the name Seventh-day Adventist Reform Movement, which makes it really kind of interesting because you don't know sometimes which one it is. So they each claim to be the original group. And again, this was the great necessity for a reformation among the people of God. The present state of the church leads to the iniquity. Volume 3 of the Testimonies. So I invite all SDA brothers, this is my invitation, all SDA brothers and sisters to come together in the one body and to give the last message of hope to our dying world. That's what I encourage any group that has found themselves outside the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Is the unity isn't unity of uniformity. I'm not asking everybody to come together and be wearing the same clothes, walking the same, marching the same march, believing everything down. We are called together to give this last message. And I just simply ask, join us in giving the message. This last message of hope to the world. That's our privilege. We think it's our duty. It's my duty to go. It's our privilege to do this, to share the gospel. Don't you want to share the good news with someone else? Christ saved you. We're in the kingdom. We're part of the covenant. What's the first plague that falls? What's the first plague of the 7 last plagues? Remember, anybody? This is a test. And this is the sores that everybody gets. Remember, they're all covered in body sores. What happens in the Old Testament when you read of any skin disease, any skin ailment, like leprosy? They're rejected. They're outside the covenant, right? They've been rejected by God. God marks the people at the beginning of the 7 last plagues. He marks all those outside the covenant because they think they're following the right covenant. the right people. They're following this false system in Revelation 13, this image of the first beast. And they think that's the truth. And God shows up, and he marks them. So they know they're not part of the right covenant. And that's what he's marking. He's marking who's in and out of the covenant. We want to bring people into the covenant. Right? That's what we're doing when we share the gospel. We're bringing them into the family so we can all go home together. That's good news. That's a joyous work. And we shouldn't have this other stuff that what it does is distracts us from what God called us to do and called us to be. We should be the happiest people on earth, which is interesting because I took a picture of Ethan and I coming back from the airport to send my wife, and I said, we look really happy, don't we? We were just a couple sad-looking characters. We didn't look happy at all. It had to be. Had a long flight for me, But we want to give this last message. So my invitation is not to set up a disconnect, but to invite people to join the gospel embodied in the three angels' message. What a privilege that is for us to do. The time when the work goes hardest is at the very time to test the spiritual strength and the wisdom to every worker. When difficulties arise in any branch of the branch of the cause, as they surely will, for the church militant is not the church triumphant. You know that, right? We're just the church militant. We're the army of God in a sinful, broken world. We're not sinless, and we're not victorious yet. That will happen. It says, all heaven is watching to see what will be the course of those who are entrusted with sacred responsibilities. Some will stumble. Some will give heed to seducing spirits. Some will choose darkness rather than light because they are not true to God. Like their master, those who are abiding in Christ will not fall nor be discouraged. I ask you, don't be discouraged, and don't let others discourage you. Or as I like to simply say, don't let somebody steal your joy. All right? And so that's the birth of the SDA Reform Movement. That's the Reform Movement that's out there. That's their basic mission. You find basically they're like Seventh-day Adventists on a lot of doctrines. But they have this disconnect, and then they have this identity crisis that they still push back upon the Adventist church. And what it does is distract us. Takes us from what God called us to be. So any questions before we close on this? Yeah. We know the background of that story with Job. She's asking about Job and his sores and stuff. And technically, because God allowed Satan to do this, technically it's a sign of God's rejection. That's why his wife says, curse God and die. Give up. You got God's curse. But God allowed him to go there. He allowed Satan to do that and put him there. And that showed Job who he was. He just didn't lay down and die. He come to terms with it. You think of another person, Miriam. She was given leprosy and not healed immediately. She had to kind of like, God put her in the corner. You go sit in the corner for a couple of days, and then we'll come back and talk. And if you remember what the issue was about, see, Moses was getting all the attention. He was God's special. Oh, you like him better. And then his brother and sister were prophets too, and they were prophets. And they kind of like wanted equal billing to get up here with Moses because they're prophets of God, and God called him to himself. He called him before the tent and chewed him out. Yeah. Chewed him out. He said, listen, prophets I talk to in dreams and visions. Moses, I like the way the Hebrew literally says it. I talk to mouth. I'm talking to Moses just like a person. But you, I give visions and dreams to. He's telling him, no, you're not just like Moses. You guys got to know where your position is in the pecking order. Moses is special here with me. And they suffered for that. But they recognized in their self-righteousness, so to speak, they got a little puffed up. But they recognized what was going on. But, yeah, sometimes God even gives the people that mark, so to speak. But then he healed her. We see the healings of the lepers in the New Testament. And we read those stories of just people who were ill and got cured, but I sometimes wonder what the underlying story is. of leprosy, cast out, separated from the people of God, and now they can rejoin the people of God. What does that mean? Lessons for us to see that we may be outside, and God has healing for us to bring us back in. Yeah? Yeah. 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 Mm. Mm. Yeah. You want a veteran, right? Right. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. All right. Let's, yeah. 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 This is interesting. If you're familiar with Romans 14:1 and following, basically, he who is weak eats vegetables, that kind of thing. We do that jokingly here in the church, because we're vegetarians. People, so I eat meat, but if you eat vegetables, you're weak in the faith. But no, the idea had to do with meats being sacrificed, being offered to idols. And people in those days would not eat meat that had been offered to an idol. And so the only thing left to eat was the herbs and vegetables. You didn't eat the meat. And Paul was trying to tell us that it didn't matter, because the idols were no gods anyways. But then in another place, he cautions against that, because we don't want to be a stumbling block. So sometimes there's things we can do, it's lawful for us to do, but not always mindful. And we can do it, just don't do it in the face of others as, I can do this, and then, because that creates a disconnect and can be a stumbling block for other people. So we do have to keep our brothers and sisters in mind. Doesn't mean you can't do it, just be aware of it, that others might have a problem with it, and so we're not there to rub it in their face. Let's have prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you that we can talk about these things, and as we do, we think about your church and the movement that you rose up, and we think about our position in it and why we're Adventists and where we are now in this walk and journey, and we ask you to indwell us, to inspire us, to fill us with your spirit and love, and help us, Father, to come along to find our place in the Three Angels message, what you would have us do and be in sharing the love of Jesus to the world, this final great message. And Father, for those who maybe are struggling and asking their place in the cause, ministry, what ministry would you have me to do? Might be upon their lips. Or what would you have us be? Pastor Ethan, he's the pastor, the shepherd of the church. But the members here are the ministers. And we ask you, Father, to bless each minister here, to give them a ministry and a vision, Jesus' vision, not their vision, not a man vision, of what you would have them do to share the love of Jesus to a world in need at the time when Christ is preparing to come. Bless us, Father, and again, as I say, help us to be a blessing to others. My prayer in Jesus' name, amen.